Hi, Commissioner. Pleasure to meet you, and thanks for making the time.
Well, thank you very much for having me, ma'am.
I have a number of questions about the G7 more largely, but I wanted to start off on the relationship between Canada and the EU, and in particular where climate is concerned. Canada, it appears, and we'll get some final details in a few days, it appears to be walking back the federal government here from some of its shorter term and medium term climate commitments. Will that, or does that, in your view, impact our relationship with the EU?
Well, first, let me state that this truly is, in our view, a relationship second to none. If you look at our values, if you look at our shared history, if you look at what we have in common in terms of just interests in how to move forward with multilateralism, with trade, and also with climate, this is a hugely important and truly pivotal partnership for us. And I'm pretty sure the same is true for our Canadian friends and partners. And that is also very much the case in the domain of climate, where we have been working seamlessly together in the past years, and also with the Carney government. I think we're doing an excellent job in teaming up.
So have the Canadians given you any indication that what you just expressed, sort of an alignment on climate, is about to change anytime soon?
Rather on the contrary, and you have an excellent Prime Minister with a long track record on this himself. You have a great climate minister in place. We're here to team up specifically with the Canadian government, and we're adamant that we need to make sure that not only we do our fair share as Europeans and Canadians together, but that we also move the needle for the rest of the world. And that type of an approach is something we are very much aligned on.
How challenging will that be, moving the needle for the rest of the world, when one of the world's largest superpowers is a member of the G7 as well, and the U.S. is abandoning its climate commitments?
Challenging. Let me just be straightforward about it. It is, if you look at the numbers, you will find that China, responsible for 31% of global emissions, have come up with an NDC that, in the view of many experts, falls short. And then indeed there is the U.S., which is the most formidable player on the globe. It is the largest economy, and it's the second largest emitter, with roughly a responsibility for 11 to 12% of the total problem. And the fact that they are checking out clearly damages the process, clearly makes it more difficult for Canada, for the European Union, and for others.
Does it augment our response? Like, does it necessitate going further? Does it necessitate something else if, in fact, we're dealing with a different context than we were just a few years ago?
Well, it clearly matters. And one of the things that is hugely important is that we incentivize and invite others to do more. Because as much as we might disagree as humans, the planet, frankly speaking, doesn't care. Climate just doesn't respond to our negotiations or our differences. It responds to how much emissions we're pumping into the air. And it is much more than just a problem for the planet or our ecosystem. This increasingly is a huge financial and also geopolitical problem. And one of the things, in my view, that we need to do, and by the way, that is also something I can only commend the Canadian government for, is we need to make sure that we bridge the domains between business and climate and independence more than what we've done in the past.
And what does that mean?
Well, that basically means that we need to focus on the opportunities that work for climate and for competitiveness. And if you think, for example, about clean tech, investments in solar, in wind, in battery technology, of which we know that the future will be dominated by them, it makes sense to double down on them and to also make sure that we have the capability to be successful in them ourselves, rather than to create a huge dependency on China and others.
I guess I would respectfully kind of challenge the idea that it makes sense to double down. And I'm much more familiar, I should say, with the Canadian case than I would be with the European. But because we're so proximate to the United States, I'll take the example of batteries, right? 2 years ago, we were all in. And the governments at the provincial and the federal level were investing taxpayer money in order to facilitate growth of that industry, because we certainly thought it was for the future, bar nothing. Unfortunately now, with the way in which things have unfolded in the United States, that is no longer the case, and we're re-examining the doubling down that you mentioned. Are you so sure that the kinds of investments that you just laid out, for example, are a sure thing?
Well, first and foremost, you're much more familiar with the specificities of the Canadian context, but I'm of course also aware of the very intimate trade relationship that you've always had, and at the same time, I've carefully listened to the Prime Minister and others who have said, look, given that this is a watershed moment, my words, not his, we need to create other trade routes, and we need to create optionality and find alternatives in terms of trading partners. And that, by the way, is something that we have very much in common. I fully understand that this is not something you also, given the battery example that you mentioned, that you do from one day to the next. But if you think 10, 20 years ahead, what the economy will then be like, what the price of batteries will then be like, what the price of electricity will then be like, how our economy will be fueled. In my view, it makes economic sense to significantly increase our exposure to that new economy, to clean tech, rather than think that things will stay the way as they are. By the way, and that might be a difference between Canada and Europe, we are a resource scarce continent. So by definition, we need to import also fossil fuels. So for us, that independence is a very clear hook to this whole conversation as well.
If I could end then actually on a question in that vein, and I take your point completely about the long term. In the short term, while you are still dependent on imports for more conventional energy, there's been a now long discussion, of course, between Canada and the EU about what role Canada can play, especially I should say vis-a-vis Europe wanting to rely less on imports from countries like Russia. In your view, is there a market in Europe for Canadian conventional energy?
Look, what you and I cannot do in this specific call is make a trade deal together.
I'm trying my best, yeah.
but what I could say, and there is huge appetite for that, is that the sky is the limit in terms of our trade relationship. But also our relationship in general. I truly meant what I said before. There are very few places who see so eye to eye in terms of their values, in terms of their shared history, in terms of their outlook in life and their sheer interests as Canada and Europe. And that certainly also is true in the domain of energy. So it is up for other folks also in the European Commission. But if I were to make a bet, I am absolutely sure that we can do much more in that domain, particularly if you think, for example, about the LNG that we will need in Europe, at least in the short run, with our Canadian friends.
Okay, on that note, I'll leave it. Commissioner, a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.